Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to our study of China, area of study 2. In this video I am going to look at the Korean War and the impact of the Korean War upon Chinese society. The Korean War itself, you can see it ran from October 1950 to July 1953, and that was when, they're the dates when the CCP, or the People's Liberation Army from China, were involved in fighting the Korean War. The Korean War itself doesn't appear in the study design, but it's still important to have a good understanding of it because it plays a significant role in this time period in the early 1950s in what was happening within China itself, not just Korea. Its main contribution was, and we'll see this in a sec, was that it intensified and radicalised many of the sort of mass campaigns that were being undertaken by the CCP during these early years of their rule in China. So with that, let's get into it. So we'll start with looking at the harmful results of the war for China. And you can see there, the first big one was 500,000 Chinese soldiers died as a consequence of fighting on the Korean Peninsula. The other big consequence of the Korean War for particularly Chinese international relations, and something we're still feeling now, was that it was only after the US entered the Korean War and the Chinese that the US decided to pledge to defend Taiwan against any attempt by the People's Republic of China to invade Taiwan and reunify it with the Chinese mainland. The other big consequence for China was that it was a huge drain on the Chinese economy. And I've got a quote here, so let's have a look. It's from Mao Zedong. And he says, Mao said in 1952 that last year, what we spent on the war to resist US aggression and aid North Korea more or less equaled our expenditures for national reconstruction. So, a year's worth of money that the Chinese government could have used to rebuild China after, remembering, they thus just fought a civil war with the GMD from 1946 up to 1949, and prior to that they'd been fighting the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937, July 1937 up to 1945. So they had been, China itself had been ravaged by war for over a decade. And if we even go back further to the instability that had been caused during, I mean, you had the GMD decade when there was relative peace, but even prior to that, the warlord decade, even during the GMD decade, the Kuomintang and Jiang Jieshi were fighting the CCP. So there had been instability, there had been wars on and off for at least, the mid-1920s. Okay, so, and this had severely damaged the Chinese economy, economic development, and the Korean War just continued that trend. So they're the harmful results of the war. Let's have a look now at the benefits the war brought to China and the CCP. So firstly, the first point there, you can see the government's call for national unity enabled Mao and the CCP to crush the remnants of the GMD on the mainland, so within China itself, and as a consequence of, it was a part of many of the mass campaigns that were occurring at this time, which we're going to look at, the thought reform and things like that. The other big point was that Stalin played no role in the war, and Mao could proudly claim that it was Chinese, not Soviet comrades, who had shed their blood in the cause of international communism. And the other big benefit on the international stage was that it showed that China could actually stand up to the US. Okay, the most powerful nation in the world. The Chinese had fought the US for 3 years, and they'd fought them to a standstill, even though the US had far superior technology to what the Chinese had. And you can see that other big point. It was the first time that China had actually matched a foreign imperialist power in a century. So going right back to the Opium Wars, the Chinese had not defeated, or at least fought to a standstill, any Western or imperialist power including Japan. The Japanese itself, when the Chinese were fighting the Japanese in the Second Sino-Japanese War, I mean, pretty much that was a victory for the US, because the US had crushed the Japanese. The Chinese had just held on. Okay, other significant points. So the impact of the war on the PRC as a nation. So as I said just then, had the huge economic costs, which Mao referred to in 1952, and then and which I referred to as well earlier. So it justified this increase in political and social repression. So it radicalised and intensified a lot of these mass campaigns that were going on at the time. So I've listed them there, and I'm going to talk about these in later videos. So the Agrarian Reform Law, the Fan Shen, that started off as quite moderate, and if we think back to my previous video where I spoke about Liu Shaoqi, I think actually refers to making sure that the Fan Shen is, controlled, make sure there's not too much repression of landlords. Well, initially under the Fan Shen, the Agrarian Reform Law, landlords, you can see there were treated more, well, it doesn't say it there, but they were treated better. Once the Korean War occurred, though, this treatment of landlords became more harsh. There were far more executions, and we're going to look at some stats by Jasper Becker about the the number that he believed died as a consequence of the Fan Shen, the Agrarian Reform Law. It's somewhere between 2 and 5 million, and we'll look at that in a coming video. Those other three mass campaigns there, the Thought Reform Campaign, the 3 Antis, the San Fan, the 5 Antis, the Wu Fan, they also became more radicalised. So people were treated more harshly. Those who were targeted in these campaigns, rather than just going through struggle sessions and things like that, it was more likely for them to be sent out to labour camps and be re-educated and remain in those labour camps for long periods of time. And anyone who tried to stop or not participate in these thought reform campaigns of the San Fan and the Wu Fan were then seen as being possible reactionaries or bad elements themselves, and then they became targets in their own turn. So that is our discussion of the harmful results of the war for China, the benefits for the war, as well as the other impacts. Let's have a look at some historical interpretations now. So let's get into it. So the first one there is from Jonathan Themby from the Penguin History of Modern China, and he writes on the Korean War: both parts of China gained from the war. Taiwan was now a core element in US Cold War strategy in East Asia, which we spoke about before, and the nationalists could be sure that Washington would veto any bid to switch China's seat on the UN Security Council to the PRC. So Taiwan was actually given a seat on the Security Council up until the 1970s, when China eventually got replaced them. For the PRC, the ability of its army to stand up to the technologically superior Americans was seen as proof of enhanced status, taken by Mao as vindication of his belief in the power of the will and the force of the revolution. This idea, Mao's belief in the power of the human will, drives many of his policies later on, particularly when we look at the Great Leap Forward, even the Cultural Revolution. This idea of Mao's that if a human being believes strongly enough in something and their cause is right, then they will achieve what they set out to. The second historical interpretation is from Philip Short from Mao A Life, and he writes: the original intention of the mass campaigns to impose CCP rule, such as San Fan and Wu Fan, was to proceed cautiously. The Korean War changed all that. So he's saying, Philip Short's saying, initially, the San Fan, the Wu Fan, these were campaigns. They weren't going to target everyone. They're going to be, be a bit more cautious about how they were going to punish people who were found guilty during these campaigns. However, the Korean War radicalised this, and the punishments became more extreme. All over China, hundreds of thousands of people marched in anti-American demonstrations in every corner of the country. Chinese seethed with indignation at imperialist atrocities. Those who did not seethe were suspected of being disloyal, and that was what I was referring to before. If someone in China didn't participate in these campaigns, if they didn't call out landlords, if they didn't punish landlords, if they didn't identify reactionaries, then they themselves were also seen as suspect, as we can see here, what Philip Short is saying. In this superheated atmosphere, the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries burned white hot. In the space of 6 months, 710,000 people, most of them linked in some way, however tenuous, with the departed Kuomintang, were executed or driven to suicide. So there's quite a good stat there. In the space of 6 months, almost or 750,000 people were punished, executed as a part of these mass campaigns. You could use this stat in your responses if you're doing a source analysis or an extended response or whatever. When you're citing stats, so when you're writing about China AOS2, please make sure, and it's sort of a bit unique, I think, to China Area Study 2, make sure that you cite the author that who has written this stat. So something along the lines of, according to Philip Short, 710,000 people died during this period. You need to cite the author because in the past, the examination report a couple of years back did identify the fact that there's lots of varying estimates about the number of, or guesstimates about the number of people who were punished or died in some of these campaigns, and sometimes these estimates, because there's quite a variety, you're trying to find the most reliable estimate, and also to make sure that you're not just making up figures. So in order to make sure you're supporting your estimates correctly, you should cite the author of that estimate or historian. Anyway, so that's our overview of the impact of the Korean War upon China during this time. I hope you have found it useful, and I shall see you next time. Goodbye.